Well, welcome back to our Root Through the Bible, and today we are going to finish up the book of Jeremiah, Lord willing. And we're starting in Jeremiah 46. Now, in these last chapters of the book of Jeremiah, 46 to 52, 7 chapters? Okay. Jeremiah is going to pronounce a judgment on the nations around Judah, around Jerusalem, and they're going to be judged by Babylon. And then in chapters 50 and 51, Babylon itself will be judged. And in the last chapter, chapter 52, God is going to describe the destruction of Jerusalem through the prophet Jeremiah, but he's going to leave them with a hope. So let's just jump into Jeremiah chapter 46. Now, Jeremiah, back in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, was described as a prophet to the nations. You remember this very famous passage? Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Now, he was a prophet to Judah in Jerusalem, but he's also a prophet to the nations. So a lot of the judgment leading up to this point is about Judah and Jerusalem because of its sin and idolatry. But now the attention turns squarely to the nations around. And he begins in chapter 46 talking about the judgment on Egypt. Verse 2 describes Pharaoh Necho and his army, their destruction in 605 at the Battle of Carchemish. This is during the time of the reign of King Jehoiakim. Now, it's very interesting that Jeremiah will begin his prophetic ministry under the good King Josiah in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. And that's in 627 BC that he begins his prophetic ministry. Well, Josiah himself is killed by Pharaoh Necho in 609. And then later on in 605, Pharaoh Necho and his army are destroyed by the Babylonians in the Battle of Carchemish. And again, this is in the 4th year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Okay? And it was a complete destruction. Verse 11 says this, go up to Gilead and obtain balm. Remember that song, The Balm of Gilead? You know, there was this healing resin that came out of Gilead, this medicine. Well, he said, go up to Gilead and obtain balm. It's kind of mocking because, O virgin daughter of Egypt, in vain they have multiplied their remedies, and there is no help for you. In other words, you're seeking all this help, but there will ultimately be no help for you. And then in chapter 46, verses 13 through 28, it describes after the defeat of Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptian army, which occurred actually kind of north of Jerusalem, the actual invasion of the homeland of Egypt itself. And so they come, and in verse 18 describes, this is the Lord's doing because of your oppression of Israel and because of your sin. And in verse 19, get your baggage ready because you're going into exile, Egypt. Egypt would be invaded by people from the north. Obviously, this is Babylon. And in chapter 46, it ends with a promise to Jerusalem and Judah of the coming back after the Babylonian captivity and looking forward to the millennial reign of Christ. Well, Jeremiah chapter 47 describes, very short chapter, just a few verses, describes the destruction of the area of the Philistines, Philistia, which occurred between 588 and 586 BC by Babylon. So it describes that destruction of the Philistines in chapter 47. Then chapter 48 describes the defeat of Moab. Verse 2, come, let us cut off her from being a nation. Verse 7, Chemosh will go off into exile. Now, Chemosh was the national god of Moab. It was much like the national god of the Ammonites, Moloch, in that it was a god, a false god, a demonic god, we might add, that encouraged child sacrifice. So Chemosh, the national god of Moab, the detestable god of the Moabites, was not able to save her. Moab will be ashamed of Chemosh. The Bible goes on to say, a few verses later, in chapter 48, Moab will be ashamed of Chemosh as the house of Israel was of Bethel. Okay, now remember, Bethel and Dan were the two places that Jeroboam the king of the northern kingdom set up these places of these worship of these golden calves. And the idols did not save Israel from their destruction when their capital Samaria was destroyed in 722 by the Babylonians. And you're going to be ashamed of your God Shemesh, as the northern kingdom of Israel was of their hope and their false gods and false calves at Bethel and Dan. Talks about that. Verse 15, God's judgment in Moab has come against you. Moab has been destroyed, declares the king, whose name is the Lord. In other words, talks about he is the Lord of hosts. Jehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. He's the one that's in control. Okay, God has brought this destruction against you. The disaster of Moab will come soon, he prophesies, and it's going to come just a few years after Jeremiah gives this prophecy, sometime between 588 and 581 BC. And the horn of Moab, verse 25, will be broken off. Remember, horn represents power, okay? Go back to the psalmist. The psalmist will write, the Lord is the horn of my salvation, the horn of my power. Horns represented power. Moab's power was going to be broken off. Verse 26, Moab's arrogance towards the Lord will make Moab wallow in its vomit. Very descriptive. Moab was very arrogant, though not a very big place. It was very arrogant against the Lord, and that was one of the reasons for judgment, and also because of her animosity towards God's people. Chapter 28 and forward, Moab is exhorted to run from the Babylonian invasion, although it will not do them any good. Verse 35, I will make an end of this nation, Moab, and her false gods. Against Shemesh, these false gods never, ever help. But yet, verse 47, the end of chapter 48, ends with this refrain that there will be a future for Moab. I'll restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord. In other words, as amazing as it may sound, the inhabitants of the area of Moab would be allowed to have some restoration during the time of the millennial reign of Christ among all the nations. Well, Jeremiah 49 kind of quickly goes through the judgment of all the nations around Judah that haven't yet been mentioned. We've mentioned the judgment of Egypt, the judgment of the Philistine area, the judgment of Moab, and now he quickly speaks to the judgment of Ammon. And remember, their god Moloch was not able to save them. But God also promises to Ammon that they, like Moab, will have a time of restoration to the millennium. Then his attention turns in verses 7 through 22 of Jeremiah 49 to the destruction of Edom. Now remember, Edom is a descendant of Esau. And so God says, now your judgment will come upon you. You will be an object of horror. And all of this, God is going to use Babylon to judge Edom as he does these other nations. But the interesting thing about Edom, or the sad thing for Edom, is that while Ammon and Moab will have a restoration during the millennium, Edom will not get one, so it's very interesting. And then he talks about the judgment in verses 23 through 27 of Aram, Damascus, Syria, that area. And then in 28 through 33, the judgment coming on these Arabian states of Kedar and Hazor. And then the judgment that will come on Elam, he talks about in 34 through 39, verses 34 through 39 of chapter 49. It's interesting. Elam will be defeated by Babylon, but he goes on to say in verse 39, in the last days I will restore the fortunes of Edom. Now it's interesting that Elam will be mentioned on the day of Pentecost. And so kind of keep that in mind, that they will be mentioned on Pentecost, and they will have a place in the millennium reign, in the future empire that Jesus Christ will rule when he rules from Jerusalem. So brings us to Jeremiah chapter 50. In Jeremiah chapter 50, 51, talk about the judgment of Babylon itself. Babylon had been used to judge all these other nations, in chapters 40 through 46, as his instrument of judgment. But now all these nations which Babylon has judged, the attention turns from them to Babylon itself. Babylon was God's instrument of judgment against Judah, against Moab, Ammon, Edom, Egypt, Philistia, Damascus, Arabia, and Elam. Well, now the judgment is coming on Babylon itself. So Jeremiah 50 and 51 talk about the judgment of Babylon. And it will come from the Medo-Persian Empire in 539 BC. An amazing event. Remember the night of Belshazzar's impious feast, the handwriting on the wall from Daniel? That's when all of that took place. Verse 2 of chapter 50. Proclaim among the nations, Babylon has been captured. Now, also about this Babylon, it also looks forward to the final form of Babylonianism, the destruction of the final form of Babylonianism, talked about in Revelation 17 and 18, the empire of the Antichrist. So Babylon is always a picture of that coming empire, as well as, of course, the empire of the great King Nebuchadnezzar and the ones that follow him. So Babylon has become an object of horror. But in verse 5, chapter 50, the Lord talks to Judah about his everlasting covenant. And this is talking about the new covenant. We observe the new covenant. We do show the Lord's death till he comes. We observe the Lord's Supper. Look back to his death, burial, and resurrection, and forward to his second coming. So the Lord has promised an everlasting covenant with those that put their faith and trust in him. And Jeremiah will, say a lot about this as well. And that will be back chapters 31 through 33 in that range. But Henry's talking about this new covenant again. Babylon is defeated. Chaldea will be plundered. In verses 11 through 16, Babylon is judged because of her mistreatment of Israel. He says in verse 11, "O you who pillage my inheritance, you who mistreat my people," God speaking of Israel. So Babylon is punished as Assyria is punished. In verse 20, references a future. The Messiah will pardon Israel's sin and bring Israel and Judah and Jerusalem, obviously, into the millennium. And Zechariah 12:10 prophesies the national repentance of the nation of Israel. But Babylon is judged. Verse 28, he says, vengeance for God's temple. In other words, they destroyed the temple, and therefore God brought judgment upon Babylon. So all of this chapter deals with that. It kind of has something interesting in verse 38. He said, a drought on her waters, for they will be dried up. And that is very fascinating, because when Medo-Persia came against Babylon, remember, Belteshazzar, again, one of the kings down from Nebuchadnezzar, is having this great impious feast, and he's behind the great walls of Babylon, and also this massive moat in the Euphrates River. Well, the Medo-Persian Empire was able to divert the waters actually out of the Euphrates River and that moat, and able to come in. And verse 44 of chapter 50 ends with this: behold, a lion comes up from the thicket of the Jordan, symbolically saying that Cyrus is going to have a lion coming up from the thicket, describing the end of Babylon at the hands of Cyrus, the Medo-Persian king. So, chapter 51, this next chapter of judgment, verse 1 says, the destroyer will be destroyed. Babylon, the destroyer will be destroyed. It uses very interesting language, talking about Abaddon or Apollyon. You remember that's from Revelation, the angel of the bottomless pit. The destroyer will be destroyed. This is kind of pointing to the fact that the power behind Babylon, of course, is Satan. As the final form of Babylonianism, the empire of the Antichrist, the power behind that, of course, is Satan too. So, for neither Israel nor Judah will be forsaken. God promises with Israel that he will rescue her. Verse 13, you who made dwell by many waters, again, kind of the fact that, okay, this great moat, great wall, locusts are coming to devour you, describing the Medo-Persian army like locusts. There are so many of them. Verse 37, Babylon will become a heap of ruins. Okay, God is coming. Babylon is about to be judged. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Jeremiah prophesied these, but he wrote these things on a scroll, actually threw them in the Euphrates River, and they were there from about 593 until the judgment of Babylon, destruction, came in 539. Very interesting. So the last chapter of Jeremiah chapter 52, Jeremiah describes all he prophesied came true. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed and burned, everything is taken away. But he ends in the very end of the last chapter with this note, and that is that in the future, in Babylon, Jehoiachin, the king, will get freedom. And this was symbolic of the fact that God is not finished with Israel and he's going to bring his people back. Wow, a lot. Read the Bible and you will get a blessing. God's plan for Israel has not been finished yet.